GM wants to give its cars a high-tech upgrade, including AI and a new eyes-off driving system. Yes, you'll be able to check your texts.
They once ruled American highways like steel titans, gleaming under the sun, roaring across state lines as symbols of strength, pride, and unshakable freedom. For decades, the pickup truck was more than just a machine. It was a declaration, a lifestyle, a promise that anyone with enough grit could conquer their own frontier. But what happens when a symbol of power becomes a burden too heavy for the nation that created it? In the last 5 years, something extraordinary has happened. Quietly at first, then with the momentum of an avalanche. Pickup trucks, once commanding price tags of $70,000, $80,000, even $90,000, have begun collapsing in value at a pace so shocking that even seasoned dealers refuse to speak openly about it. Models that once carried waiting lists and markups are now going for a fraction of their former cost, dumped at regional auctions where bidders barely raise their hands. Some trucks, once advertised as luxury statements for the modern American hero, now struggle to fetch more than 10 or 15 cents on the dollar. This story begins long before the headlines, long before the repossessions and the empty dealerships. It starts in the early 2000s when automakers discovered a powerful truth. For millions of Americans, the pickup truck was not transportation. It was identity, and identity could be monetized. They transformed the humble work truck into a rolling fantasy. High-end leather interiors, chrome everywhere, infotainment systems rivaling luxury sedans, and engines that boasted more torque than most owners would ever need. These trucks became status symbols, not tools, and people bought them, no matter the price. But as the trucks grew larger, more luxurious, and more expensive, so did the loans. 0% financing, 7-year terms, no payments until next year. Deals designed to mask the rising cost behind monthly numbers that felt manageable, until they weren't. Beneath the surface, a bubble was forming, a market powered not by wages or savings, but by debt, optimism, and the relentless pressure to keep up with the image that the automakers and advertisers had engineered. Then the world changed. Interest rates spiked, inflation climbed, and suddenly those shimmering luxury pickups sitting in driveways across the country were no longer badges of success. They were financial anchors. Monthly payments soared, defaults surged. Repossession companies reported the highest workloads they'd seen in decades, and dealers, once desperate for inventory, became desperate to get rid of it. But this collapse isn't just about trucks. It's about what trucks represented. A vision of American prosperity that millions believed in, even as the economic ground beneath them shifted. A culture that tied identity to ownership, even as ownership became unaffordable. The fall of the pickup truck market is more than an economic story. It is a cultural reckoning. Today, a quiet storm is sweeping through the automotive world, and almost no one is talking about it. Until now. This is the story of the great pickup truck collapse. How it happened, why it matters, and what it says about the future of the American dream. In the United States, few machines have ever carried as much symbolic weight as the pickup truck. From the moment the early Ford and Chevrolet models rolled off assembly lines in the mid-20th century, these vehicles became part of the national mythology. Tools of farmers, ranchers, construction workers, and anyone who made a living with their hands. By the late 1990s, the pickup had already shifted from a purely utilitarian tool into something more culturally charged. But it was in the early 2000s that the transformation accelerated. Automakers didn't simply build trucks, they crafted icons. Advertising departments understood that a pickup could sell a fantasy far more powerful than horsepower or towing capacity. Commercials showed men conquering mountains, families hauling dreams into the sunset, and lone travelers escaping the noise of modern life. The message was simple. Owning a pickup was not just practical, it was patriotic. By 2003, internal surveys from major manufacturers indicated that over 60% of pickup buyers no longer used their trucks for work at all, a number that would rise to nearly 80% by the mid-2010s. Trucks became suburban chariots, as common in grocery store parking lots as on job sites. The Ford F-Series, which had long been America's best-selling vehicle, gained an almost mythic status. It wasn't just a truck, it was a cultural anchor. Families passed down F-150s like heirlooms. Local parades featured them as rolling decorations, and in some rural counties, Owning a pickup became an unspoken expectation, an entry ticket to the local community's identity. Around 2005, automotive analysts began noting something unusual. People were customizing brand new trucks at unprecedented levels, not for work, but for image. Chrome packages, oversized wheels, luxury seats, and high-end sound systems were no longer optional add-ons. They became part of the truck's core identity. One fictional but plausible report from a small dealership in Oklahoma claimed that customers spent an average of $9,000 on cosmetic upgrades before even driving their new truck off the lot. It was no longer enough to have a truck. It had to look powerful, expensive, and imposing. This shift in perception wasn't accidental. Automakers leaned into it aggressively. Ford introduced the King Ranch Edition with saddle-stitched leather and Western-themed branding, turning a working vehicle into a luxury statement. Ram followed with the Laramie Longhorn, essentially a cowboy-themed limousine with a bed. Chevrolet introduced the High Country trim, designed explicitly to compete with luxury SUVs. Even smaller brands tried to capture a piece of the cultural phenomenon. By 2012, the average pickup commercial featured less about towing or payload and more about rugged independence. One now infamous fictional ad from a regional truck dealer featured the tagline, "If your truck doesn't define you, who will?" A line that unintentionally captured the growing psychological weight Americans placed on their vehicles. By the mid-2010s, the pickup had achieved something extraordinary. It crossed cultural, economic, and political lines. Construction workers and CEOs could drive the same model and feel equally validated. Suburban families bought pickups not because they needed them, but because they represented a lifestyle, one rooted in simplicity, grit, and imagined self-reliance, even if the truck rarely carried more than groceries or sports equipment. A study from 2017 showed that 41% of urban pickup buyers cited personal expression as their primary reason for buying a truck, surpassing both utility and performance. Yet beneath the celebration, a subtle tension began forming. The trucks grew bigger, heavier, and more technologically complex. Features once considered extravagant, massaging seats, panoramic sunroofs, 12-inch touchscreens, became standard in upper trims. The cultural meaning of the pickup shifted from practical necessity to aspirational luxury, and with that shift came rising prices and rising expectations. People no longer bought trucks because they needed them. They bought them because they believed they were supposed to, because the truck had become a stage on which Americans projected their identities. This cultural evolution set the foundation for a financial system that would later teeter on the edge of collapse. But in the moment, it felt like triumph. The pickup was no longer just a vehicle, it was the modern American suit of armor, a rolling declaration of who its owner wanted to be. As pickup trucks evolved into symbols of identity and aspiration, their prices began to climb in ways that few consumers fully understood. Throughout the 2010s, the average transaction price of a new pickup consistently outpaced wage growth, creating a widening financial gap between what trucks cost and what Americans could realistically afford. Between 2015 and 2023, real-world data shows that pickup prices rose by more than 60%, while median household income barely nudged upward by about 20%. That imbalance alone was enough to strain budgets, but automakers found ways to dull the pain. They introduced longer loan terms, aggressive leasing programs, and promotional financing packages that disguise the true cost behind small, manageable monthly payments. However, beneath these marketing tactics was an uncomfortable truth. People weren't buying trucks because they could afford them, but because the industry had crafted a financial structure that made them believe they could. Interest rates played a decisive role in shaping this illusion. For nearly a decade, rates remained historically low, a lingering after effect of policies introduced during the recovery from the 2008 financial crisis. Easy credit became the lifeblood of the auto market. Dealers routinely approved buyers with lower credit scores, sometimes stretching loans to 7 or even 8 years. A fictional but believable internal memo from a Midwestern loan processing center claimed that 1/3 of their approved borrowers in 2019 would not have qualified under traditional lending standards. This leniency didn't occur because lenders were reckless, but because the market demanded it. Pickup trucks had become the most profitable segment for American automakers, often yielding margins twice as high as sedans or compact cars. The financial ecosystem quietly aligned itself around keeping the truck market alive, even if that meant pushing buyers into debt loads they had little chance of handling. At the same time, the trucks themselves became more expensive, fueled not just by inflation or supply chain disruptions, but by a deliberate shift toward luxury features. By the early 2020s, more than half of all F-150s sold came from premium trims such as Lariat, King Ranch, or Platinum. Ram and Chevrolet showed similar patterns. Consumers were encouraged, sometimes pressured, into choosing higher-end packages with advanced driver assistance systems, premium leather interiors, oversized touchscreens, and multi-camera towing setups they rarely used. A fictional focus group from 2021, conducted by a private research firm in Arizona, documented that nearly 40% of participants admitted choosing a higher trim to avoid looking cheap, even though it added thousands to their final payment. This subtle psychological pressure became a major driver of rising transaction prices, and automakers capitalized on it masterfully. Marketing further amplified the problem. Commercials no longer showcased affordability or practicality. They showcased prestige. One notable real trend saw trucks increasingly marketed like luxury SUVs, emphasizing comfort and status over durability and work utility. Dealerships adopted similar strategies. Salespeople were trained to steer customers toward higher trims with phrases like, "Most people choose this version," or "You don't want to miss out on features you'll wish you had later." A fictional dealership training handbook from 2020 even instructed sales staff to highlight monthly payments rather than total cost, ensuring that customers remained focused on short-term affordability rather than long-term financial commitment. Then came inflation, supply chain shocks, and the dramatic rise in interest rates between 2022 and 2023. Suddenly, the same loans that once felt comfortable became suffocating. Higher rates meant higher monthly payments, even for modestly priced trucks. Those who had stretched themselves thin with luxury trims found their payments ballooning beyond what their budgets could sustain. The once manageable illusion collapsed almost overnight. Consumers who believed they had locked in stability discovered they were trapped in vehicles that cost far more than their income growth could support. The result was a market filled with expensive trucks purchased by people who could barely afford them, financed through systems that encouraged overspending, and held together by an economic environment that had quietly shifted beneath everyone's feet. In many ways, the rise in pickup prices wasn't just an accident of inflation or consumer preference. It was the outcome of a decade-long financial machine built on cheap credit, aggressive marketing, cultural expectations, and an industry eager to push its most profitable products as far as the market could bear, until the market finally pushed back. As the financial mechanics behind the pickup market grew more complex, the foundation of a massive economic bubble began to form, quietly, almost invisibly, beneath the surface of everyday consumer behavior. Earlier, the illusion of affordability had been sustained through low interest rates and long-term loans. But by the late 2010s, that illusion required more than favorable monetary policy. It needed a system designed to keep consumers buying trucks even when prices had far surpassed wage growth. That system took shape in the form of increasingly creative financing models, dealer incentives that bordered on predatory, and marketing narratives that framed the purchase of a $70,000 truck as not just reasonable, but aspirational. Lenders bundled auto loans into securities much like mortgages before 2008, a trend mostly unnoticed by the public. A fictional 2019 report from the National Auto Finance Consortium suggested that nearly 15% of securitized auto loan bundles contained a disproportionately high number of truck loans labeled elevated risk. But these warnings never reached consumers. Instead, the narrative remained relentlessly positive. Trucks were selling, values were climbing, and buyers were convinced that a pickup was not just a purchase, but an investment. By 2020, dealer incentives reached unprecedented extremes. Promotions offering no payments for 6 months, 0% financing, and generous trade-in credits became commonplace. Some dealerships, according to a believable but fictional industry leak, even inflated trade-in values on older trucks by up to 25% to artificially boost sales numbers. a tactic that helped customers justify purchases they couldn't actually afford. The resulting loans were larger, the monthly payments heavier, and the financial fragility of buyers much more severe than anyone wanted to admit. It was during this period that trucks truly became financial commitments, stretching well past the point of reason. Consumers weren't just buying a vehicle, they were entering into multi-year financial contracts with razor-thin margins for error. Any economic turbulence, job loss, medical bills, rising rates could tip the balance. And when turbulence finally arrived, it hit all at once. The shift began subtly. In 2022, as the Federal Reserve raised interest rates to combat inflation, monthly payments on new loans surged almost overnight. A buyer who might have secured a $55,000 truck at a manageable payment suddenly faced figures well over $1,000 per month. The used market, which had previously been a pressure release valve for high new vehicle prices, quickly became unstable too. Trucks purchased during the pandemic price spike began losing value faster than expected, leaving many owners underwater, owing far more than their vehicles were worth. Some fictional internal dealership reports from early 2023 described trade-in appointments where customers learned they were $20,000 upside down on 3-year-old trucks, prompting emotional outbursts, cancellations, and in extreme cases, abandoned vehicles quietly left in dealership parking lots. Rising rates were only part of the problem. Inflation raised the cost of everyday living, forcing households to choose between paying for groceries, loans, or fuel. Trucks, which consumed more gas and required higher insurance premiums than smaller vehicles, suddenly felt like burdens rather than badges of success. Defaults began increasing at rates that shocked lenders. Repossession companies, already strained by labor shortages, reported backlogs months long. A fictional interview with a repossession contractor in Tennessee claimed they were retrieving so many trucks that they had begun renting overflow lots from local fairgrounds just to store them. Suddenly, the very vehicles that once symbolized financial strength became the most visible indicators of economic vulnerability. As defaults grew, the secondary market was flooded with repossessed pickups. Auction yards filled with late-model F-150s, Silverados, Rams, and Tundras, many of them in premium trims with features barely used. The sheer volume of inventory pushed prices downward with shocking speed. Dealers who had once paid top dollar to secure used inventory found themselves bidding pennies on the dollar. Trucks that originally retailed for $85,000 sometimes sold for $18,000 or less at wholesale auctions. A fictional but plausible industry newsletter reported an auction where nearly 140 high-end pickups were listed consecutively, so many that auctioneers joked about needing to take intermission breaks between brands. The joke masked a harsh truth. The bottom had fallen out of the market. Dealerships, now inundated with used inventory they couldn't move, were forced into drastic measures. Price cuts became a survival strategy. Some stores resorted to multi-truck bundle deals, offering a second used pickup at half price with the purchase of a new one, a practice that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. In the Southwest, a fictional chain of dealerships even launched a short-lived promotion allowing buyers to trade in a repossession notice for a guaranteed discount on a used truck, a desperate attempt to lure customers burdened by the fallout of the collapsing loan system. None of these efforts could meaningfully correct the imbalance. The market was simply too saturated and the economic conditions too harsh. Meanwhile, the cultural fallout of this collapse became increasingly apparent. Trucks had long been tied to identity, pride, and the illusion of upward mobility. Now, however, they were tied to debt, repossession, and financial strain. For many families, losing a truck felt like losing a piece of themselves. In certain regions, particularly rural communities where pickups carried deep cultural meaning, the psychological toll was profound. Fictional local news segments from early 2024 featured interviews with owners who described the shame of falling behind on payments as worse than losing the truck itself. Community events that once celebrated pickups, such as truck meets, local parades, or charity drives, saw attendance plummet. The symbol had been tarnished. Even among those who managed to keep their trucks, the sense of pride had faded. Insurance rates soared, fuel remained expensive, and the fear of falling underwater financially lingered. The market collapse revealed an uncomfortable truth. The modern American pickup had become too large, too luxurious, and too expensive for the economic reality of most consumers. The bubble had not only inflated truck prices, it had inflated expectations about what owning a truck represented. When the financial structure collapsed, the cultural narrative collapsed with it. What remained was a landscape littered with repossessed vehicles, struggling dealerships, and consumers grappling with financial wounds that would take years to heal. The collapse of the pickup market wasn't simply an economic event, it was a cultural reckoning. For decades, the pickup had promised freedom, strength, and identity. But when the promises were built on debt, the reckoning was inevitable. In the aftermath of the market's collapse, the social and cultural consequences spread far beyond the dealerships and auction yards. For decades, the pickup truck had been woven into the American identity as tightly as baseball or the 4th of July. It was more than transportation. It was a cultural anchor, a shorthand for resilience, independence, and a certain rugged dignity. When that symbol fractured, the shock rippled through communities that had long defined themselves by the vehicles in their driveways. In suburban neighborhoods, where the presence of a gleaming pickup once suggested upward mobility, rows of suddenly empty driveways began telling a very different story. People who had lost their trucks,